There is a kind of history that refuses to stay buried, not because it survived untouched, but because the world itself still carries its echoes. Every island, every sea, every kingdom, and every pirate sailing across the Grand Line exists because of stories that began long before anyone living could remember them. Tonight, we leave behind the battles and the bounty posters and instead follow the quiet thread that connects every era of the one-piece world, from its forgotten beginnings to the age of pirates we know today. If these peaceful one-piece stories help you relax, you're warmly invited to subscribe and let me know where you're listening from tonight. Now, as the ocean grows calm and the stars settle overhead, we'll begin the complete lore of One Piece, following its oldest memories one gentle chapter at a time, until the entire world slowly unfolds before us. The shape of the world. Picture a globe, but not an ordinary one. Wrapped around the entire planet, running pole to pole, is a single continuous wall of stone so immense that ships cannot cross it and storms cannot erode it. This is the Red Line, and it divides every ocean on the planet into 4 separate seas: the East Blue, the West Blue, the North Blue, and the South Blue, each cut off from the others by that impassable ridge of rock. Now picture a second line running perpendicular to the first, wrapping the world the other way, a churning belt of unpredictable current and magnetic chaos called the Grand Line. Where the Grand Line crosses the Red Line, the 2 great barriers intersect, and the 4 blues each touch the Grand Line at a different point along its length, like 4 spokes meeting at a wheel's hub. This means every sea in the world is connected only through this one difficult passage, and nothing about that passage is gentle. The Grand Line itself doesn't behave like a normal ocean. Compasses spin uselessly here, pulled in every direction by shifting magnetic fields, which is why sailors rely instead on something called a log pose, a compass that locks onto the magnetic signature of a single island at a time, guiding a ship forward, one destination at a time in a sequence it cannot skip or reorder. Without one, a sailor on the Grand Line isn't navigating. They're guessing, and the sea rarely rewards guessing. The Grand Line is itself split in half by the Red Line. The first half, the gentler half, is called Paradise, and it's reached through an entrance called Reverse Mountain, where the current defies gravity and pushes ships upward from the 4 blues into the Grand Line proper. The second half, on the far side of the Red Line, past a kingdom called Fishman Island, resting at the ocean floor, is called the New World, and it is exactly what the name suggests, a place where the rules everyone learned in Paradise stop applying, and the truly powerful people of the world have already settled in, because nothing weaker survives there for long. Around the Red Line's base and around certain other treacherous stretches of ocean lies the Calm Belt, water so still it has no current and no wind, which sounds peaceful until you learn why. The Calm Belt is home to the Sea Kings, ancient serpentine creatures the size of islands, whose stillness in the water isn't tranquility, but rather a kind of dense, watchful hunting ground. Ships without the specific means to cross the Calm Belt safely simply don't. The 2 calm belts, north and south of the Red Line's intersection with the Grand Line, are part of why the Grand Line's difficulty compounds itself, hemmed in on every side by things too dangerous to cross casually. At the very top of the Red Line, high above the risen sea, sits Marie-Joie, the Holy Land, home to the world's ruling nobility. We'll come back to who lives there and why, because the answer connects to almost everything else in this story. For now, just hold the shape of it all in your mind. 4 separate seas, a churning highway between them, an ocean too still to safely enter, and a wall of stone tall enough to touch the sky, with a palace at its summit. Devil fruits and the price of power. Scattered through this world, rare and strange, are objects called devil fruits, and eating one changes a person permanently and irreversibly. Each fruit grants an ability entirely its own, and no 2 fruits are exactly alike, though they tend to sort into 3 broad families. Paramechia fruits grant a specific altered property, a body that stretches or hardens or turns intangible or manipulates a substance the user doesn't otherwise control. Zoan fruits grant the ability to transform into an animal, or a hybrid state between animal and human, tapping into a kind of ancestral memory the fruit seems to carry. And Logia fruits, the rarest and most feared, let the user's body become an actual element, fire, lightning, sand, smoke, allowing them to become the very substance itself, nearly impossible to strike with ordinary force. There is a cost woven into every single one of these gifts. Anyone who eats a devil fruit permanently loses the ability to swim. Not struggles with it, loses it entirely, so completely that the moment they touch open seawater, their strength drains out of them and they sink like something made of stone. In a world defined by ocean, this is not a small price. It means every devil fruit user, no matter how powerful on land or on a ship's deck, carries within them one specific and total vulnerability, and the ocean itself, patient and enormous, is always somewhere nearby. Hockey, the will made physical beyond devil fruits. There exists a second kind of power, one that isn't eaten or granted, but drawn out from inside a person's own spirit. This is hockey, and it comes in 3 forms. Armament. Hockey lets a person coat their body or their weapon in an invisible hardening force, strong enough to injure even Logia users who would otherwise be untouchable, and strong enough to block attacks that would otherwise pass clean through flesh. Observation. Hockey extends a person's awareness outward, letting them sense danger, sense intention, sometimes sense the near future in the half-second before it happens, a kind of perception that has nothing to do with the 5 ordinary senses. And Conqueror's hockey, the rarest of the 3, radiates outward from a person's will alone and can overwhelm the minds of everyone nearby who isn't strong enough to resist it, a power that cannot be trained into existence in someone who doesn't already carry the seed of it. Some people are simply born with it. Most people who possess hockey spend years discovering they have it at all, let alone learning to direct it. It exists in nearly everyone in trace amounts, but only in a small number of people does it ever grow into something usable. And in an even smaller number does it grow into something that can reshape a battlefield. The world government and the order built atop the old one. Now for the structure of power layered across all of this ocean and stone. At the top sits the world government, formed by an alliance of 20 founding royal families, and beneath it operates the Marines, the uniformed military and police force of the seas, led by a fleet admiral and a small number of admirals whose individual strength rivals entire fleets. Beneath the Marines operates a shadow layer of intelligence agencies called the Cipher Poles, plainclothes agents who investigate, infiltrate, and when necessary eliminate threats the Marines can't be seen handling publicly. For a long stretch of the timeline we're about to walk through, the world government also maintained a system called the Warlords of the Sea, in which certain especially dangerous pirates were granted official pardons and a measure of protection in exchange for occasionally fighting on the government's behalf when called upon. It wasn't an arrangement built on trust. It was built on the plain admission that piracy in the New World couldn't be eliminated, only managed. And managing it sometimes meant recruiting the very people you couldn't defeat outright. Above all of this, above even the Marine Fleet Admiral, sit 5 figures called the 5 Elders, and above the 5 Elders sits an empty throne in the innermost chamber of Marie-Joie, a throne that was always said to be symbolic, representing the shared and equal authority of the 20 founding families, with no single ruler above the rest. For centuries this was the official story, believed even by most people inside the government's own upper ranks. It was not entirely true, and we'll get to why later when the story catches up to the present day. At the very top of the social order, above the Marines, above the nobility of ordinary kingdoms, sit the celestial dragons, the direct descendants of those 20 founding families who live inside Marie-Joie in conditions of almost total insulation from the rest of the world, immune from ordinary law and permitted privileges so absolute that even the most feared pirates in the world tend to approach them with real caution. Beneath the celestial dragons and the Marine command structure sit the ordinary kingdoms of the world, dozens of them, each with its own royal family, its own customs, its own quiet arrangement with the government above it. Some kingdoms, like Alabasta, sit inside the world government's protection willingly, trading a measure of independence for the safety that comes with belonging. Others, like Wano, for most of its recent history, close their borders entirely and simply refuse to participate in that arrangement at all, a choice that tends to come with its own very particular cost, paid for slowly, over generations, by the people living inside those closed borders. And threaded through every layer of this structure, present in every kingdom, every sea, every era we're about to walk through, is the pirate flag, the Jolly Roger, which in this world isn't simply a symbol of lawlessness. It's closer to a signature, a declaration of identity and intent that a crew carries with them everywhere they sail. The strength of the person flying it is usually measured, at least roughly, by something called a bounty, a price the world government places on a pirate's head once that pirate has done something the government considers dangerous enough to be worth publicizing. Bounties climb over the course of this story from modest numbers in the tens of millions of berries to figures so large they stop functioning as numbers in any ordinary sense and start functioning as warnings, a way of telling every Marine base and every rival crew in the world exactly how much caution a single name now requires. Above even the ordinary emperors and warlords of the New World sit the Yonko, the 4 emperors, pirates, whose individual power is treated as roughly equivalent to a nation's, each commanding their own stretch of territory, their own fleets, their own uneasy truce with the world government, which prefers a fragile balance among four enormous powers to the far riskier alternative of trying to eliminate any one of them outright. That's the scaffolding. Geography, ability, hierarchy, the small, unglamorous print of daily life underneath all of it. Now let's go back to the very beginning, because none of this scaffolding explains itself. It was all built piece by piece, layer over layer, on top of a much older history that the people building it worked very hard for a very long time to make sure nobody could ever read again. If you're comfortable so far and settling in, feel free to subscribe for more of these long, slow lore walks. Let's go back 5,000 years. The deepest past. O'Hara and the Tree of Knowledge. On an island called O'Hara, roughly 5,000 years before the era we now call the present, a tree was planted by a civilization devoted entirely to preserving knowledge. It grew across centuries into something closer to a living library, its roots and branches eventually sheltering scholars who spent their lives reading the oldest surviving fragments of history, including a language etched onto indestructible stone tablets called poneglyphs, written in script that almost nobody in later ages could read at all. The scholars of O'Hara understood something uncomfortable from very early on, that the world they were studying stretched back further than their own civilization by an almost unimaginable margin, and that a great deal of what had actually happened in the deep past had been deliberately obscured. That single unanswered question, what really happened and why was so much of it erased, would follow O'Hara for 5,000 years. It followed them right up until roughly 22 years before the present day, when the island scholars, led by an archaeologist named Nico Olvia, finally succeeded in translating enough of the ancient script to begin understanding what the true history actually contained. The world government's response was total. A buster call, the highest level of military action the Marines can authorize, one that treats an entire island as a single target to be erased rather than a place with individual people inside it, was called down on O'Hara without warning. The island's library burned, its scholars were killed, and the specific narrow goal behind that devastation was to make certain that nobody capable of reading the old script survived to keep reading it. One person did survive, a small girl who ran for the last boat leaving the island as everything behind her burned, saved in her final moments by a giant named Jaguar D. Saul, who told her, before the two of them were separated in the chaos, that someone somewhere would always be glad she was alive. That girl was Nico Robin, and she would spend the next 2 decades of her life running, carrying both her mother's research and the full weight of an entire government's determination that she should not exist. We'll meet her properly later, much further along in the story, still running, still alone, until the day she finally isn't anymore. Alabasta, Elbaf, and the Old Kingdoms, 1,000 years after that first tree took root. In a kingdom called Alabasta, a great desert palace was built to last, a declaration in stone that a people intended to remain on that land permanently. Centuries later, a poneglyph would be discovered buried beneath that very palace, one that a man named Crocodile would spend years hunting, in hopes it led to a weapon called Pluton, only to find the stone held something other than what he expected. Around the same era, on the island of Elbaf, home to a civilization of giants, a structure was raised whose exact purpose has never been fully recorded, but whose existence confirms that Elbaf was never simply a kingdom of warriors. It was also a kingdom of builders, of long memory, of people who understood their own history stretched back further than any single lifetime could witness. The giants of Elbaf lived remarkably long lives, long enough that an elder among them today might have been a young adult during the era of Gol D. Roger, a child during the era before that, and might carry living memory of events that most of the rest of the world only knows from fragments. Roughly 1,500 years before the present, a calendar system called the Sea Circle began its count, evidence that the world at that time was interconnected enough to need a shared way of marking time at all. A calendar isn't just convenient. It's a form of agreement between distant communities, and its existence tells us the ancient world was more connected than the fractured present ever quite managed to become again. Shandora and the City in the Clouds. 1,100 years before the present, on an island once called Jaya, a civilization called Shandora reached the height of its greatness, a city with golden towers visible from a great distance out at sea, and a purpose that went beyond wealth or politics. Shandora had been entrusted with a poneglyph, and its people devoted their lives to protecting it, whether or not they fully understood the message carved inside it, simply because protecting it was the responsibility they had inherited. Their fighting style was built entirely around this idea, refusing to let the thing in their care ever be taken. Generations of Shandorans lived and died beside that stone, ringing a great bell at set hours, carrying out a vigil that would eventually stretch across more than 1,000 years. Through an upheaval so violent it launched their entire city into the sky, where it became the floating ruins later known as Sky Paia. The vigil did not end when the ground disappeared beneath them. It simply continued 5,000 meters higher, in the clouds, where almost nobody below even knew to look. Zunaisha and the Minks. Around 1,000 years before the present, an enormous elephant the size of an island was already ancient, already carrying an entire civilization on its back without apparent effort. This was Zunaisha, and the people who made their home there were the Mink tribe, humanoid animal people capable of generating electricity in their most powerful combat state. 1,000 years ago, in response to upheavals reshaping the wider world, the Minks withdrew from it almost entirely, naming their new home Zu, and living there in deliberate isolation ever since, carrying within their culture secrets connected to a samurai, a hidden clan, and a plan that would take a full 1,000 years to come due. During this same era, a feud began between the Long-Arm tribe and the Long-Leg tribe, its original cause lost entirely to time, its grievance carried forward anyway with the same intensity as if the wound were fresh. And on the other side of the world, a desire for revenge so consuming that ordinary means couldn't satisfy it led one group to offer something no ordinary bargain should require. And the answer to that offer eventually took the form of a skeleton musician who would spend 50 years sailing alone before anyone found him. The Age Before the Fall. Joy Boy's civilization. 900 years before the present, the world reached a height it has never matched again since. Not one kingdom, not one empire, but a vast interconnected network of people stretching from one end of the known world to the other, building technology and infrastructure that the centuries since have never fully replicated or even fully understood. The blueprints for one of that civilization's greatest weapons would still be studied and debated by the finest minds available to the Marines 9 centuries later, without anyone quite grasping the whole of it. It was during the earliest days of this era that a man appeared unlike anyone before him. He had eaten a devil fruit whose true nature would remain hidden by the world government for the next 800 years. A fruit connected not simply to physical transformation, but to an idea, a kind of freedom so complete that no chain could hold it and no rule could contain it. This man took the name Joy Boy, and he became something the world hadn't quite had a word for yet. Someone who recognized no authority higher than the freedom of the open sea. He wasn't a simple hero. He was someone with enormous power and an equally enormous sense of responsibility toward the people he cared about. Someone who, in the end, failed to keep a promise he had made with everything he had. His civilization built 3 weapons of world-altering scale named Pluton, Poseidon, and Uranus. Pluton was a warship of such staggering size and destructive capacity that the word battleship barely applies to it. Poseidon wasn't a constructed weapon at all, but a living title, held by a mermaid princess born with the ability to command the ancient sea kings, those same enormous creatures patrolling the calm belts in the present era. And Uranus has never been fully revealed to anyone outside that ancient circle, its nature still one of the deepest unsolved mysteries in the entire present-day story. Joy Boy had a personal connection to the Poseidon of his own era, a mermaid princess of Fishman Island, and together the two of them had been building something without precedent, an enormous ark called Noah, meant to carry the entire population of Fishman Island up from the ocean floor into the sunlight they had never been able to reach. Joy Boy made a formal promise that he would be the one to finally deliver that dream. And then, for reasons the historical record never fully preserved, the attempt failed. Noah was never raised. Joy Boy left behind an apology, carved into a poneglyph at the ocean floor, a simple, sincere acknowledgement that he had broken his promise, along with a quiet statement of faith that someone else would eventually come who could finish what he could not. That apology sat mostly unread at the bottom of the sea for the next 800 years. During this same era, an enormous automaton called Emet was built by the civilization's craftspeople, constructed from a metal that could resist corrosion and damage across centuries of total dormancy, designed to wait, indefinitely if necessary, until the specific conditions that would reactivate it were finally met. It would, in fact, wait for exactly 800 years. The void century, and now we arrive at the event that shadows every single conversation about this world's history. The 100 years that were violently and deliberately erased from the written record, later known only as the Void Century. It began with Joy Boy civilization at its absolute height, and it ended with nearly all of that civilization gone, the world remade, and an entirely new order installed in its place. 20 royal families formed an alliance against that great civilization. Their individual motivations, fear, ambition, ideology, some combination of all three, have been buried as thoroughly as the war itself. What remains are the consequences, and those consequences are still shaping the present-day world in ways most people alive today don't even recognize as historical at all. Shandora, that golden city that had stood in defiance of everything the world had thrown at it for over 1,000 years, was destroyed in the fighting, launched skyward by the same geological forces unleashed by the ancient weapons. Joy Boy civilization lost. The 20 royal families won. And in the immediate aftermath of that victory, Joy Boy did what he had done with every important promise across his life. He found a place to leave something behind. He sailed to the final island at the end of the Grand Line, an island that would later be called Laugh-Tale. And there he stored the treasure that would come to be known simply as the One Piece. What it actually is remains the single deepest secret still standing in the present-day story. The ocean itself rose 200 meters in the immediate aftermath of the war, swallowing every coastline too low to survive the shift, a geological consequence of the ancient weapons' use at such catastrophic scale. The red line remained above the new water line, the tallest terrain left standing, and the 20 royal families who understood what was coming had already positioned themselves at its peak. There had been others living up there first. The Lunarians, a people capable of generating fire from their own bodies, were displaced entirely, their history reduced almost to nothing by the present day. The 20 families settled into a city they called Marie-Joie and named themselves the Celestial Dragons, nobility above ordinary law, and they built the world government around their authority, the very structure we described earlier, the marines, the cipher poles, the whole apparatus. Poneglyphs were placed across the world during this same era by a clan called Kozuki, indestructible stone tablets serving two purposes at once, a record of what had truly happened that could never be burned or edited, and a map, a set of directions that when gathered completely would point the way to Laugh-Tale itself. The world government responded to their existence by making them illegal to read, illegal even to study with scholarly intent, and outlawed the ancient script entirely, enforcing that silence with total military force whenever necessary. That single policy is what eventually reached Ohara 5,000 years after its scholars first planted their tree of knowledge, and it's what reached a young woman born in the Kozuki clan named Toki, who had eaten a fruit granting her the ability to send herself and others forward through time, never backward, only forward. In a directed leap she could aim, but never fully control. If any of this ancient history is the kind of thing that helps quiet your mind before sleep, this is a good moment to subscribe, and to tell me, if you like, where you're listening from tonight. The long middle. The world rebuilt. The centuries that followed reorganized the entire map. The four blues, the Grand Line, the New World, all of it took its present shape from that single catastrophic reshaping of the sea. Fishman Island remained at the ocean floor, a kingdom of extraordinary beauty and, for centuries, extraordinary prejudice, its people regarded by much of the surface world as lesser despite their strength and their ancient lineage. The dream of finally rising to the surface stayed alive there for generation after generation, connected in ways nobody could quite articulate to a promise made and broken 800 years earlier. Roughly 400 years before the present, an explorer named Mont Blanc Noland sailed from the kingdom of Lovenil and found Shandora still standing on the island of Jaya, its golden towers catching the morning light, its people in the middle of a crisis caused by a disease his training as a botanist let him understand in ways the Shandorans could not. He cured it. He made a genuine friend in the Shandoran chief, Calgara. And then, in the course of eliminating the disease's source, he cut down a grove of trees the Shandorans held sacred, an act he intended as kindness and Calgara experienced as an unforgivable betrayal. Noland sailed home and told the truth about the golden city he had seen, and when he returned with his king to prove it, the island had already been launched into the clouds by forces neither man understood, leaving nothing behind but jungle and silence. Noland was executed as a liar. His logbook became a children's story about the dangers of false claims. It would take centuries, and a small boy named Usopp, a distant descendant of Noland's own family, standing in Shandora's actual ruins, to finally understand that his ancestor had told the truth the entire time. During these same long centuries, a figure known only as Im sat on the supposedly empty throne at the center of Marijois, unacknowledged by anyone outside the innermost circle of government, while the 5 elders operated as the administrative layer between that hidden throne and the rest of the world, a consistency maintained unbroken for centuries through every change of marine admiral, every warlord granted or revoked. God Valley, roughly 38 years before the present day, on an island that no longer appears on any official map, one of the most significant and most thoroughly buried military engagements in recent history took place. A pirate named Rox D. Zebek had assembled the single most dangerous crew the world had ever seen, a roster that included a young Kaido, a young Charlotte Linlin, and a young Edward Newgate, each of whom would go on to independently reshape the world in the decades that followed. Rox wanted something beyond even the title of Pirate King. He wanted to sit above the world government entirely. The government's response to that threat has never been officially acknowledged. They allied with a young pirate named Gold D. Roger and with a marine hero named Monkey D. Garp, and together the 3 forces defeated the Rox pirates. Rox died there, the crew scattered, and the island itself was erased from every record, because what had happened at God Valley demonstrated something the government could never afford to let the wider world understand, that even its full strength alone had not been enough, that it had needed help from the very kind of person it claimed to exist in order to control. Roger, Laughtail, and the dawn of the great pirate era. Gold D. Roger possessed a rare and unexplained ability called the voice of all things, letting him hear messages inaudible to almost anyone else, including, in time, the ancient poneglyph script itself. Once a man named Kozuki Oden joined his crew as the last living person who could read it. Together, over years of sailing the Grand Line, Roger's crew gathered all 4 road poneglyphs needed to calculate the route to Laughtail, and they became the only crew in the 8 centuries since the Void Century to actually complete that journey and reach the end of the Grand Line. What Roger found there, whatever the full truth of that ancient history turned out to be, laid out in its entirety, made him laugh so completely, so long, that the island itself would eventually take its name from that laughter. He understood, he said later, that he had arrived at the truth too early to be the one who acted on it. Roger was already dying by then, a disease no doctor available to him could treat, and rather than let it take him quietly out at sea somewhere with nobody to witness it, he turned himself in at Logue Town, the very city of his birth, and asked to be executed there rather than anywhere else. The world government agreed eagerly, believing a public execution of this scale would demonstrate their authority over the entire pirate legacy once and for all, a final and definitive answer to anyone who might romanticize what Roger represented. Word spread fast enough that people came from across the East Blue and beyond just to witness it, some hoping to see the end of an era, some quietly grieving it, most simply drawn by the gravity of a moment they understood would never come again in quite the same way. Roger stood on that scaffold without any visible fear at all, and when he was given his final words, he didn't offer a confession or a plea. He told the enormous crowd gathered beneath him that his treasure, the one piece, was real, that it was out there somewhere in the world, and that if any of them wanted it badly enough, all they had to do was go and look for it themselves. Then he died, and the great pirate era began, not as a policy or a movement or anything the world government could have prevented with more force, but simply as what happens when one man tells the truth loudly enough at exactly the right moment for an entire world to hear it at once. A boy named Luffy, not long after Roger's execution, in a village called Fuchsia in the East Blue, a child was born named Monkey D. Luffy, grandson of the Marine hero who had fought at God Valley, and son, unknown to him for years, of the most wanted revolutionary in the world. At 7 years old, Luffy ate a devil fruit that had been hidden in a barrel for the entire 8 centuries since Joy Boy's disappearance, one the world government had spent that whole time hunting under a false name, specifically so nobody would understand what it actually was. He didn't know any of that. He ate it because he was hungry, and it was in front of him. A red-haired pirate named Shanks spent a season in that same village, and though he refused, gently and repeatedly, to let a small child join his crew, he did leave behind his own straw hat, with instructions to return it once Luffy had become a great pirate himself, a debt Shanks paid for personally when he lost an arm saving Luffy's life from a sea monster the boy had provoked, and never once seemed to regret it. Luffy grew up alongside 2 brothers who weren't related to him by blood at all. Portguest D. Ace, the secret son of Goldie Roger, and Sabo, a runaway noble who chose the honest poverty of the Gray Terminal over his own family's gilded home. The 3 of them made a pact over cups of sake. None of them were legally old enough to drink, promising to become great pirates and to never let anything stop them. Sabo appeared to die soon after in a tragedy involving Goa Kingdom's corrupt nobility, a loss that stayed with both remaining brothers for years, though the truth that Sabo had actually survived and been taken in by the Revolutionary Army remained hidden from all 3 of them for a very long time. The East Blue and the First Crew. At 17, Luffy set out alone in a barrel with nothing but his hat and his decision to become the Pirate King, a decision he had made as a small child, long before he had any real idea what the title cost the last person who held it. The East Blue, the gentlest of the four seas, gave him exactly what he needed to begin. Not the strongest possible crew by Grand Line standards, but a crew of people whose individual strengths fit precisely around the shape of his own weaknesses. Roronoa Zoro joined first, found tied to a post in a Marine base courtyard, having chosen a third option nobody had offered him between submission and execution, simply refusing to do either. Zoro carried a promise made to a childhood friend named Quina, who had died young, that one of the two of them would become the greatest swordsman in the world. And he had decided to carry both of their ambitions forward in his own name alone. Nami joined after years spent secretly working for a fishman pirate named Arlong, stealing treasure in a desperate, endlessly reset attempt to buy her village's freedom, each success stolen back from her by a corrupt Marine captain in Arlong's pocket, until Luffy, without needing to understand every detail of what she had been carrying silently for years, simply walked into Arlong's stronghold and tore it down. Usopp joined at Syrup Village, a boy who had spent his whole childhood telling elaborate lies about pirates to give himself something to look forward to, and who became one for real the moment it actually mattered. Sanji joined from a floating restaurant called the Barati, chasing a dream of the All Blue, a mythical sea where the fish of all four blues supposedly gather together in one place, the ultimate expression of what cooking for the whole world might actually mean. Their first ship, a small, unremarkable vessel called the Going Merry, given to them in gratitude by a young girl they had protected from a scheming pirate butler, carried them out of the East Blue through the upward-flowing current at Reverse Mountain and into the Grand Line proper, a sea that operates by an entirely different set of rules than anything they'd known before. They met Laboon there almost immediately, a giant whale who had spent 50 years ramming himself against the Red Line, waiting faithfully for a crew who had promised to return for him and never had. They met two giants locked in a 100-year duel over a grievance neither of them could fully remember anymore, bound by a code of honor that wouldn't permit either one to simply stop. They met Tony Chopper on Drum Island, a reindeer who had eaten a fruit granting him human traits, rejected by both the animal world and the human one his entire life, who joined the crew the moment Luffy asked him plainly and without conditions, something nobody had ever offered him before. In Alabasta, Luffy fought a warlord named Crocodile, who had spent years quietly engineering a civil war in hopes of uncovering the ancient weapon Pluton beneath the kingdom's sand. And in the aftermath, Nico Robin, the same girl who had run from O'Hara's burning library 20 years earlier, asked to join the crew rather than keep running alone, framing it, in her own careful way, as a decision she had made unilaterally rather than something she needed permission for. In Skypiea, they climbed 5,000 meters into the clouds aboard a rising sea current and found the very golden city Noland had described centuries earlier, still ringing its great bell, still keeping its impossibly long vigil, and Robin quietly read the poneglyph hidden there, learning something about the weapon Pluton that she would choose not to share with anyone else, for years afterward. Water 7 and the turning point. At Water 7, their ship, damaged beyond any possible repair after years of hard sailing, needed to be laid to rest, and a shipwright named Frankie told them so honestly. In the middle of that grief, the government's elite cipher Pole 9 agents kidnapped Robin, believing she had allowed herself to be taken because she still believed, the way she always had, that her presence brought danger to everyone around her. The Straw Hats' answer was the assault on Eni's lobby, a fortress island considered impenetrable, where Luffy rang the island's great bell simply because he wanted the world to hear it, and had the government's own flag burned in full view of everyone watching. A declaration that this particular government's authority over this particular person was something they no longer recognized. The Going Merry, unable to continue after everything it had carried them through, gave one final act of effort to bring them out of that battle before finally gently refusing to go any further. Frankie built them a new ship and then joined the crew to sail it properly. At Thriller Bark, they found Brooke, a skeleton musician kept alive across 50 years of solitary sailing by a fruit that had once brought him back from death, still trying to keep his own 50-year-old promise to return to Laboon. Marineford, at the Sabati Archipelago, the last stop before the New World, the Straw Hats found themselves surrounded by an entire generation of dangerous new arrivals. 11 rookie pirates the newspapers had already begun calling the worst generation, each carrying a bounty so high it announced them as a coming threat, before they had done anything to fully earn the title yet. Trafalgar Law was among them, moving with the calm of someone whose plans always extended further ahead than whatever was happening in front of him. Eustace Kidd was among them too, blunt and explosive in a way that made him Law's opposite in almost every visible respect. It was the kind of gathering that made it plain, even to Luffy, that the era of easy victories in paradise was ending, and that the new world waiting just beyond the archipelago wasn't going to measure strength the same way the East Blue or even most of the Grand Line so far had. The incident that detonated everything at Sabaody involved a celestial dragon, a world noble, who did what world nobles in this story tend to do when they encounter people they consider beneath them, which is to act as though consequences are a concept that applies to other people. One of Luffy's allies was shot for the crime of standing too close. Luffy answered by punching the man in the face, an act that, in the strict letter of this world's law, counts as something close to declaring war on the entire government at once, because a celestial dragon only has to report an insult, real or imagined, to summon an admiral in response. Kizaru arrived, moving at the speed of light, treating the resulting battle with an almost cheerful disinterest that turned out to be far more unsettling than open rage would have been. It was in the middle of that overwhelming mismatch, the crew's first real collision with a Marine admiral, that the true distance between where they stood and where they still needed to go became impossible to ignore, and it was in the middle of that same battle that the crew's collision with the true upper tier of the world's power sent them scattering, each thrown to a different corner of the ocean by a warlord named Bartholomew Kuma, acting on quiet orders meant to protect them from an admiral they had no real chance of surviving. Alone on Amazon Lily, the island home of the Kuja pirate empress Boa Hancock, Luffy learned that Ace had been captured by a man named Marshall D. Teach, who had betrayed and killed his own crewmate to acquire the power of the darkness fruit, then turned Ace over to the government specifically to earn warlord status for himself. Ace was to be executed publicly at Marine headquarters, a way of finally erasing what remained of Roger's bloodline for good. Luffy's response was immediate and, by any reasonable measure, entirely irrational. He went straight into Impel Down, the government's supposedly inescapable undersea maximum security prison, alone, relying on Hancock's connections to get past its outer layers, fighting his way downward through levels specifically designed to prevent anyone with a devil fruit from functioning effectively at all, sustaining damage along the way that should have stopped him more than once. He arrived too late to prevent the execution from proceeding at Marineford, the Marines' own headquarters, where Edward Newgate Whitebeard brought his entire fleet to try to save Ace, not because Ace held any strategic value to him, but because Ace was his son in every way that actually mattered. The battle that followed was broadcast live across the entire world through transponder Snail, every blow visible to every kingdom watching at once, 3 admirals present, most of the active warlords summoned, the full weight of the government's available force gathered against a single old man's refusal to lose another child. Luffy reached the battlefield already broken and exhausted, running on something that couldn't quite be measured in ordinary terms, and eventually reached Ace himself. The chains came off. For one brief moment the worst of it seemed to be over. Then an admiral, provoking Ace deliberately by speaking about his father, drew him back into the fight rather than let him walk away with the insult unanswered, and the attack meant for Luffy was intercepted by Ace instead. Ace died on that battlefield with Luffy holding him, saying quietly that he had no regrets, that he was glad he had been born. Whitebeard died shortly afterward, facing the entire remaining Marine force alone, so the rest of his own crew could escape. Struck by blows that would have ended anyone else's life many times over before the one that finally finished him, declaring with his last breath that the treasure Roger had spoken of all those years ago was real, and that someone, someday, would find it. 2 years. Luffy's collapse afterward wasn't only physical. Silver's Rayleigh, Roger's own first mate, found him on Amazon Lily and offered training rather than comfort. 2 years, spread across the crew, each person sent somewhere suited to what they still needed to learn. Luffy trained on a brutal, isolated island until he understood Haki in all 3 of its forms deliberately rather than by accident. Zoro trained under the very swordsman he'd promised to surpass. Nami studied weather. Sanji endured something he still refuses to discuss in detail. And when 2 years had passed, as if by unspoken agreement, they all returned to Sabayoti at exactly the same time.